Hey guys, tonight we'll delve into a story that fundamentally changes the definition of childhood, the story of Edward VI. This is the king who inherited the English throne when he was only 9 years old. Imagine the cruel contrast. While other 9-year-old children still live in a world of storybooks and toys, Edward was stripped of his innocence by history, forced to wear the heavy crown of supreme power. The tragedy was sealed from the moment Edward was born. His mother, Queen Jane Seymour, passed away just days after his birth, leaving the future king isolated. Growing up under the overwhelming shadow of his father, King Henry VIII, Edward was educated not to be a son, but to be a divine agent with the ruthless mission of completely purifying the Church of England from all Catholic remnants. What did Edward accomplish for the country at the age of 9? His radical will was far from immature. We'll witness this young king coldly recording the execution of his own uncle, uncompromisingly confronting his Catholic sister over her faith, and embracing an audacious vision for an England that was thoroughly militarized and fiercely Protestant, a burden too heavy to bear for a heart that hadn't fully grown. But the greatest tragedy is this. All those ambitions, all those struggles, and all those grand plans were brutally cut short. He did not live long enough to see his vision realized. He died far too young, at the age of 15, taking with him not only his dreams of reform but also the direct male line of the Tudor dynasty, plunging the country into a horrific succession crisis. Edward fought to save his Protestant empire, but his death ultimately pushed England back into the chaotic future he always desperately sought to avoid. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is, your local time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Edward VI's arrival on the 12th day of October in the year 1537 marked more than the birth of another royal child. It signified the culmination of a generation's longing and the salvation of a dynasty's future. After nearly a quarter century of anxious pursuit for a male heir, King Henry VIII beheld at last the fulfillment of his most fervent prayer. In his private chambers at Hampton Court, the king reputedly cradled the newborn in his arms, whispering words of wonder, "O God, thou hast granted to me the jewel of my heart." For Henry, whose marriages had been shaped by the dynastic imperative to secure the Tudor succession, Edward's birth dispelled the spectre of a contested inheritance and affirmed the stability of the realm. Within the vast tapestry of the Tudor dynasty, Edward's birth wove a new thread of hope. His paternal grandfather, Henry Tudor, later crowned Henry VII, had seized the crown by right of arms and ambition, ending decades of civil war between warring houses. His union with Elizabeth of York had symbolized the healing of a fractured kingdom, yet for the Tudors, true security lay in the birth of sons who would follow without challenge. Each of Henry VIII's first 2 marriages had produced daughters Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, whose legitimacy and prospects were repeatedly called into question by shifting alliances and schismatic divorces. In that uncertain context, Edward's emergence heralded a renewal of dynastic confidence, for he was the first male Tudor heir of the royal line since the founding of their house. To the broader circle of Tudor nobles and ministers, Edward's birth was akin to a divine assurance that the policies of his grandfather and father would endure. The dissolution of the monasteries, the assertion of royal supremacy over the church, and the sweeping reforms that had shaken the very foundations of medieval England all now seemed destined to continue under the guardianship of a male sovereign. Courtiers and commoners alike spoke of the infant Edward as the living pledge of the Tudor state, a phrase that circulated in hushed tones through palace corridors and country taverns. His life embodied the promise that the Tudor experiment, at once revolutionary and conservative, would not falter for want of a legitimate heir. Even the ceremonial pomp of his christening 3 days later underscored the far-reaching import of his arrival. In the chapel's gallery, tapestries depicting the Tudor rose and Yorkist white rose hung side by side, a visual testament to unity and continuity. Trumpets sounded not merely for celebration but as a proclamation. The Tudor line would persist. Prince Edward was invested with the titles Duke of Cornwall and Earl of Chester, ancient honorifics once bestowed upon heirs to the throne, thus reaffirming England's feudal bonds and the sacred duty of the crown to protect its people. Yet amid the grandeur, the infant prince's fragility was never far from the minds of his keepers. The death of Jane Seymour, his mother, mere days after his baptism, cast a brief shadow over the court's rejoicing. King Henry was said to weep openly at her passing, for Jane had been more than a vessel for succession. She was the gentle companion who had soothed him in his latter years. Her loss reminded all that the future of the Tudor line depended not only on birth, but on the health and nurture of the child. Hence, Edward's infancy unfolded under the watchful care of Margaret Bryan and Blanche Herbert, governesses whose careful ministrations ensured that the living pledge would survive to manhood. From his earliest days amongst the women of the nursery, Edward absorbed the rituals and responsibilities of kingship even before he learned to stumble across the marble floors. His half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, bore witness to his christening, and though their own claims to the throne had been trimmed by royal decree, they shared in the court's hopes. Elizabeth, sewing a tiny coat for her brother, and Mary, offering gentle encouragement in games of tilt-yard and archery, embodied the familial bonds that buttressed the Tudor house. Their presence with the prince symbolized both the unity of blood and the tension of succession, a reminder that even royal love could be entwined with the stern necessity of dynastic survival. In the large perspective of English history, Edward's birth represented a turning point. The medieval world of papal supremacy would soon cede ground to the Reformation under his reign. The royal prerogative opened the door to centralized governance, and the seeds of modern statecraft, sown by his grandfather and father, awaited the steady hand of a male monarch to take root. For Henry VIII, Edward's birth was the crowning achievement of his reign, proof that the Tudor legacy would not soon fade. And so, beneath the golden canopy of that crib hung in Hampton Court's chapel, the future of England began to stir in the sleeping form of a prince. In his first breaths, the Tudor dream of stability and reform found a living vessel. The echoes of that moment would resonate for centuries, a reminder that the birth of a child, however royal, carries with it the fragile promise of hope, and that in his small hands lay the destiny of a nation. Edward was, by all accounts, a robust and hearty child far removed from the frail figure that some have imagined. In May of 1538, scarcely 7 months after his birth, King Henry VIII was observed at Hampton Court, playing with the babe in his arms, then carrying him to the window for the people to behold. Such a public display was more than affection. It was a proclamation that the long-awaited Tudor heir was strong and thriving. By September of that same year, Thomas, Lord Audley, the Lord Chancellor, reported to the king that young Edward was growing apace and in excellent health. Modern historians, examining household accounts and court correspondence, confirm that Edward was no delicate infant, but rather a vigorous boy, save for a serious bout of fever at the age of 4 that threatened his life. Though he sometimes suffered from poor eyesight and the odd illness, throughout his childhood Edward maintained a constitution that would have pleased even the sternest Tudor physician, remaining hale and hearty until the final, frail half-year of his life. From his earliest days, Edward's care was entrusted to the gentle ministrations of Margaret Bryan, who oversaw his first months, and later to Blanche Herbert, whose steady hand guided him through toddling steps in the marble corridors. He grew up amongst the women, as he would himself record in his chronicle, surrounded by nurses, ladies-in-waiting, and governesses who tended not only to his every need, but also to the rigorous standards of hygiene and security that King Henry demanded. The sovereign, ever mindful that his son represented the jewel of the realm, ordered that no detail be overlooked from the purity of the prince's drinking water to the swaddling linens kept forever fresh. When Edward reached the age of 6, his education began in earnest. Under the tutelage of Dr. Richard Cox and John Check, both learned men of the Reformed persuasion, yet still within the fold of the Catholic Church. His curriculum spanned the study of languages, the Holy Scriptures, philosophy, and the liberal arts. By candlelight he absorbed Latin grammar, passed passages of Greek philosophy, and committed to memory the Psalms in the original tongue. In parallel, he received instruction in French from Roger Ascham and in Spanish and Italian from Jean Belmain, each lesson a testament to his father's ambition for an heir, versed in the broad scholarship of Renaissance Europe. Beyond letters, Edward showed a restless appetite for geography and the sciences. He assembled a small menagerie of globes and maps, tracing coastlines with a slender finger and dreaming of distant lands. In the evenings he coaxed gentle melodies from a lute or virginals, his small hands navigating strings and keys with surprising dexterity. Later, he applied himself to the study of currency, learning the weight of a noble and the value of a groat, as though preparing himself to oversee the very coffers that funded his kingdom's fortunes. Yet for all his reformist zeal, Edward's religious upbringing retained echoes of the old faith. He attended Mass with solemn devotion, knelt before images of the saints, and regarded holy relics with reverence, even as Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and the ever-present hand of his tutors whispered of a new era in which the Pope would hold no sway over English devotion. In 1549, he penned an essay decrying the Pope as the Antichrist, annotating theological debates with a zeal that foreshadowed the reforms he would later enact. Throughout these formative years, Edward's half-sisters showed him tender affection. Elizabeth, 2 years his senior, once sewed him a tiny crimson coat, each stitch a testament to her care. Mary, the elder by over a decade, indulged him with gentle rebukes when he teased her for daring to dance. Yet he adored her all the same, writing in a letter, "I love you best, sister mine." In 1543, at Christmas, King Henry summoned all his children to court in a rare gesture of family unity. The following spring, the third act of succession restored Mary and Elizabeth to the line of inheritance, thanks in no small part to the influence of Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth wife. Edward, who called her "my most beloved mother," wrote to her in September 1546, "I have received so much from you that my mind cannot comprehend it." Thus, beneath the watchful roofs of palaces and the tender ministrations of devoted caretakers, Edward VI grew strong in body and mind. His childhood combined the rigour of scholarly pursuit with the warmth of familial devotion, forging in the boy prince the disciplined spirit and compassionate heart that would, though all too briefly, steer England through one of its most transformative eras. In the year 1544, the renowned court painter Hans Holbein the Younger completed a monumental work now known simply as The Family of Henry VIII. Yet, upon closer inspection, one recognizes that this is far less a portrait of familial affection than it is a grand proclamation of royal authority. At the center of the composition stands Henry VIII himself, his broad shoulders and commanding posture conveying the immovable strength of the Tudor monarchy. Immediately to his right appears the figure of Jane Seymour, though she had departed this life long before the brush first touched canvas. Her presence there serves no tender reminder of conjugal devotion, but rather underlines her vital role as the mother of the long-awaited male heir. Snuggled at Henry's right hand, an intimate but unmistakably symbolic gesture, stands the young Prince Edward, barely 6 years of age, already designated in paint as the embodiment of dynastic continuity. Flanking this central trio are the princesses Mary and Elizabeth, each represented in regal attire. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, had each suffered the indignity of being declared illegitimate upon their mother's divorces, only later to be restored, albeit tentatively, to the line of succession by an Act of Parliament. Their inclusion in Holbein's painting thus signals not an equal place in the family circle, but rather Henry's explicit intention to present a clear, hierarchical order of inheritance. First Edward, then Mary, and lastly Elizabeth. By placing Jane Seymour, though long deceased, immediately beside himself, Henry projects his triumph over mortality and cements, in the public eye, the indissoluble bond between his person and his progeny. The decision to include Jane Seymour's posthumous effigy reveals the astute political mind of Henry VIII. He understood that the peace and stability of the realm depended upon an unambiguous line of succession, unchallenged by rival factions or foreign powers. Thus he commanded Holbein to depict the mother of Edward alongside the monarch, effectively stamping her eternal seal upon the dynastic order. In this calculated composition, each figure becomes more than flesh and blood. They are avatars of policy and promise. The prince's small hand resting at Henry's side is a silent but potent declaration that the Tudor legacy would continue uninterrupted, even in the face of familial tragedy and ecclesiastical upheaval. Mary and Elizabeth's polished gowns and demure stances might suggest grace and purity at first glance, yet their very inclusion speaks to the undercurrents of courtly intrigue. By reinstating them to the succession second and third, after Edward, Henry forestalled any potential power struggles by leaving no shadow of doubt as to who would follow upon Edward's failure to produce heirs. He fortified his realm not only by the sword and by the law, but by the unyielding clarity of visual propaganda. From that moment on, Any whisper of contestation, whether from nobles eager to expand their influence or from foreign claimants seeking advantage, found itself confronted by the crisp lines of Holbein's canvas and the immutable hierarchy it displayed. For the young Edward, then but a child of 6, the experience of seeing himself in that painting must have been quietly bewildering, yet it conveyed a lesson as stark as any lesson in his later education, that the royal court was no playground of sentimental bonds but rather a theatre of power, where each gesture and portrayal carried weighty significance. He would come to understand that, much like the painted figures who stood eternal on the walls of Hampton Court, his own life, as delicate and fleeting as a child's, was irrevocably bound to the grand designs of statecraft. As one's gaze drifts across the expanse of tapestry and finery, noticing the subtle hierarchies of scale and placement, it becomes clear that Holbein's masterpiece functions less as a familial tableau than as a visual codex of Tudor succession. It laid the groundwork for decades of political manoeuvring, for the alignment of factions, and for the precarious balancing act that would follow in the wake of Henry's passing. There, in paint, the young prince learned the silent language of legitimacy and the inexorable realities of courtly ambition. And so, in the hushed corridors where that portrait hangs, the image of Edward VI, small yet indelibly present, remains a testament to the profound power of art to shape dynastic destiny. It reminds us that portraits can serve not only to capture likeness but to inscribe authority, that a single painting might steer the course of history by declaring, in the stillness of pigment on wood, the unassailable right of a boy to wear a crown. By the time Edward reached the age of 6, the playful afternoons spent among painted tapestries and echoing corridors gave way to a rigorous curriculum at Hampton Court. Each morning, as the pale dawn light filtered through high windows, he was led to a chamber lined with books and vellum scrolls, where he commenced lessons in reading and writing English before progressing, by slow and steady increments, into the more demanding realms of Latin grammar and syntax. Here, too, the Holy Scriptures were laid open before him, their passages both a moral compass and a linguistic challenge, while the works of Aristotle and Cicero introduced him to the art of dialectic and the stirring complexities of classical philosophy. And woven throughout his studies were the liberal sciences, geometry, astronomy, and rudimentary natural philosophy subjects that invited him to gaze beyond earthbound concerns toward the patterns of the universe. His first and most dreaded tutor was Dr. Richard Cox, a fervent advocate of the Reformed faith who wielded both pen and birch with equal conviction. Each lesson began with prayer, but it was the swift crack of Cox's birch rod that most often heralded the prince's correction. Should Edward falter in his declension of Latin nouns? Should he question the supremacy of the monarch over the papacy? Or should he, even in a moment of childlike contrariness, balk at the tutor's stern instruction? The rod would fall upon his small shoulders, as a reminder that obedience and discipline were the bedrock of royal authority. Through these harsh admonishments, Cox instilled in the young prince an unshakable belief that religious power must reside with the crown, not in distant Rome, and that the ancient rites of the church statues, relics, and processional crosses were impediments to a purer, godlier form of worship. One surviving fragment of Edward's youthful writing illustrates this transformation clearly. In a draft of his French essay opposing the Pope's temporal claims, Edward originally employed the pronoun we, thereby aligning himself with all oppressed believers. Yet Cox excised that inclusive we, insisting that the language better reflect the singular authority of a sovereign. The word was struck through and replaced with he. That subtle shift from communal solidarity to royal detachment reveals the tutor's lasting imprint. The boy's identification with the faithful he championed was tempered by the primacy of his own regal office. As Edward committed these lessons to memory by the crack of dawn and the flicker of candlelight, he absorbed not only words, but convictions. His journal entries, penned with unwavering neatness, described the Pope's claims as anti-Christian snares, and praised the notion of a national church unmoored from papal interference. In his leisure hours, he would pace the garden walkways, reciting passages of the liturgy in English, mindful of the day when the Mass itself would be delivered in the tongue of the people, unshackled by ecclesiastical tradition. Through this austere education, the once cuddly, wide-eyed boy emerged with a mind sharpened by both scholarship and severity. He developed a steely resolve, a capacity to wield authority without hesitation, a trait that would later manifest in his unflinching enforcement of iconoclastic policies and his uncompromising stance toward any who defied royal injunctions. The gentle laughter that once echoed through the nursery gave way to a measured calm, and the affectionate warmth of nursery rhymes was succeeded by the solemn cadence of reformist prayers. In the glow of torchlight, during late-night sessions, Edward's eyes, once round with childhood wonder, gleamed with the chill light of determination. He saw the world not just as a place of beauty and ceremony, but as a realm in need of purification. The whitewashed walls of parish churches, the stripped altars, and the black-letter proclamations all bore testament to the vision Cox had nurtured. And though the prince retained a fondness for music and a soft spot for his friends, the hardness imparted by his tutor's rod remained central to his character. Thus it was that the birch and the Bible, the Latin declensions and the daily scourge against papal authority fused in the crucible of education to transform Edward from a darling infant into a monarch of formidable will. The boy who once nestled against his mother's breast grew into a king unafraid to wield the crown's full power. His reforms both a testament to his learning and a reflection of the strict lessons delivered at Hampton Court. And in those quiet chambers, as candle flames danced upon vaulted ceilings, the steely resolve of England's 9-year-old sovereign first took root, a resolve destined to reshape church and state in equal measure. On the 28th of January in the year 1547, the great Tudor monarch Henry VIII drew his final breath, and in that quiet hush, 9-year-old Edward Tudor became King of England and Ireland. Though the crown settled upon his small head in solemn ceremony, the true reins of government passed into the hands of a regency council, an assembly formed to guide the realm until Edward reached his majority. At its helm stood his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, a man whose courteous bow belied the sharp ambition glittering in his eyes. Somerset's influence over the council was swift and sure, as he sought to shape both policy and patronage in the name of the young king. Yet even amidst the shifting currents of political power, Edward's coronation at Westminster Abbey marked something far more profound than mere ceremony. There, beneath the soaring arches, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, delivered a sermon unlike any heard before. He proclaimed, in a voice carried to every corner of the vast nave, that Edward's authority flowed directly from God, requiring no blessing of pope or prelate to validate his reign. Instead, this crown was ordained by Providence alone, and the boy king stood charged with a single sacred mission: to reform and to purify the Church of England itself. Not long after the coronation's torchlight faded, the new king's name adorned proclamations that spread like ripples across the countryside. Parish churches, once bright with painted saints and resplendent stained glass, saw their images whitewashed over. Craned wooden crucifixes, symbols of an older faith, lay shattered upon stone floors, and in their place fluttered the royal arms lion, and unicorn framing the Tudor rose a stark emblem of the monarch's unmediated power. Villagers in Devon and Kent watched as church wardens tore down carvings and murals, the echoes of hammer on wood, marking the dawn of iconoclasm across the land. For Edward, though barely 9, this wave of reform placed him at the very centre of a bold new era. In his private diary, he noted each report of removal. The rood screen at Street Mary's has been brought low, its painted Christ laid aside for the Book of Common Prayer. Even as the council executed these measures, the boy king felt their gravity, understanding perhaps more clearly than many that this was no mere rearrangement of pews, but the cleansing of centuries of belief. The hammers that rang through village churches were the opening notes of a grand symphony of change. No longer would the Mass be celebrated in the old Latin tongue, nor would the faithful rely on carved images to inspire devotion. Instead, the word of God would resound in plain English, and the altar, once a table of sacrifice, became a simple communion platform, a gathering place for all to share in the body of Christ. Walls once adorned with scenes of the Virgin's sorrows or the martyrdom of saints now stood bare, their whiteness a testament to the resolve of a reformed church. Of course, such sweeping transformation was not without its tremors of unrest. In hamlets far from London's stone walls, murmurs of disquiet rose among those who held fast to the old traditions. Yet, for each flicker of resistance, there came the firm hand of royal decree. Commissioners dispatched with royal warrants, fines imposed for any who harboured relics, and the ever-present eye of Somerset's regents ensuring that no image, however cherished, survived to lead souls astray. And so, Though Edward remained but a child, he bore the weight of his grandfather's and father's reforms, feeling their reverberations in every newly whitewashed chapel and every proclamation that banned the sign of the cross. His childhood laughter in the halls of Hampton Court mingled with the solemn hymns sung in English at dawn, and his small hand, accustomed to play and parchment, now turned the pages of the prayer book as readily as he once traced lines in his primers. In that early year of his reign, Edward VI became the living emblem of a Protestant England, a kingdom poised between medieval ritual and modern faith. Though the crown upon his head was light, the purpose it represented pressed upon him as heavily as any iron crown might. And in the gentle hush that followed each act of reform, one could almost hear the boy king's whispered vow to shepherd his people into a purer worship, to stand unbowed before the old rites, and to guide England along a path illuminated by the clear light of the gospel. As images of saints faded into memory and church bells tolled a new refrain, the 9-year-old king stood at the threshold of history, his tender years matched only by the vastness of his charge. In the soft glow of candlelight, he would learn that power, once donned, demands both courage and conviction, and that the truest reform begins not only in statutes and sermons, but in the heart of a sovereign who dares to imagine a brighter dawn. Under the new regime, the boy king still delighted in the freedoms of youth, loosing arrows at the targets in the archery butts, tracking fox and stag across the misty woods, and trading clever jests with his dearest companion, Barnaby Fitzpatrick. Yet the true levers of power rested in the grasp of his uncle, the Duke of Somerset. As Lord Protector, Somerset oversaw the royal treasury with a calculating eye, trimming the prince's allowance until even pocket money for fresh fletching or a new hunting horn required a royal warrant. He navigated the treacherous currents of court politics to sideline other rivals, most notably Lord Suffolk, whose secretive deliveries of coin to the young king earned him charges of disloyalty and eventual banishment from royal favour. In the quiet glow of Somerset's ascendancy, the court grew restless. The year 1549 ushered in a bold proclamation. The Book of Common Prayer in English would replace the Latin Missal, and the realm's worship would henceforth proceed in the tongue of the people. Across Devon and Cornwall, Sussex and Gloucestershire, villagers seized their newly printed books and set them aflame in public squares, a fierce rebuke of change. Bands of rebels rose up, torches in hand, accusing the commissioners of trampling ancient rites and tearing the soul from the parish churches they had loved for generations. Edward watched the unfolding events as though they were a lesson in strategy. He pored over dispatches by candlelight, marking troop movements and siege tactics in his private journal. When Somerset's forces cornered a cluster of insurgents in the rolling hills of Somerset, and the royal army executed hundreds in a single brutal day, the prince recorded the victory with an almost clinical detachment, noting only that the rebellion was quelled with due force. In that moment, the young king's heart remained unmoved by the anguish wrought upon those peasants. To his mind, order and obedience were the bedrock of a stable kingdom. Yet for all the harsh measures, Edward found solace in the unwavering loyalty of Barnaby. Since their earliest days playing in the court's gardens, the two had formed a bond that transcended rank and ritual. Barnaby alone could coax a genuine smile from the king's lips when the rest of the court lingered in sombre deference. In the pressured hush that followed each grim dispatch, Barnaby's presence reminded Edward that beneath the weight of crown and counsel, he was still a boy in need of friendship's gentle refuge. Their companionship unfolded in secret letter exchanges and whispered confidences. After council meetings, Edward would retreat to the privacy of his chambers and read Barnaby's missives, filled with admiration and loyalty. When the young king's guard faltered, whether from a pang of homesickness or a momentary pang of doubt, Barnaby's steadfast words rekindled his courage. "Remember," he wrote, "that your cause is just and your people need your resolve." In those lines, Edward found the quiet reinforcement that no political intrigue or regent's ambition could provide. This friendship became the anchor of Edward's spirit, helping him weather the storms of power plays and rebellions. Though Somerset held the purse strings and often directed policy, Edward knew that in Barnaby's counsel lay a mirror of his own convictions, unclouded by the self-interested designs of courtiers. With each challenge, the removal of rood screens, the clampdown on recusants, the stern suppression of revolts, Barnaby's faith in Edward's vision bolstered the king's own determination to place religious reform and the welfare of the realm above all personal concerns. In this turbulent season, The prince's character crystallized: playful archer and ruthless monarch, tender friend and stern reformer. He learned that to wield authority effectively, one must balance firmness with compassion, decree with dialogue, and that even the smallest voice of loyalty like Barnaby's could sustain a sovereign through the loneliest of nights. And so, as archers' arrows cut through dawn mist and church bells tolled the New English liturgy, Edward VI stood at the heart of a nation reborn, anchored by friendship, driven by conviction, and resolute in shaping England's destiny on the firm ground of Protestant faith and royal prerogative. In the turbulent year of 1549, the western counties of England erupted in fierce rebellion against the new religious settlement. From Devon's rolling moors to the winding lanes of Gloucestershire, villagers seized their printed English prayer books and cast them into roaring bonfires, shouting defiance into the night air. Bands of rebels accosted travelling soldiers and royal commissioners, driving them from parish churches with stones and scythes, as though determined to restore the Latin Mass by force if necessary. In Sussex, the uproar grew so violent that marketplaces emptied and gentry shuttered their manors, fearing the flames would spread as rapidly as the insurgents themselves. King Edward VI, though barely 12 years of age, watched these events unfold with a detached intensity his private journal preserved brief, clinical entries that read like tactical reports rather than cries of sympathy. He noted, for example, that the suppression at Taunton had resulted in 160 taken, of whom 20 hanged and 80 slain, appending with a sober flourish that the king's peace was thereby restored. To Edward's mind, these brutal measures were necessary exercises in disciplined movements of troops and placements of pikemen that might rival any drill in the Tower's courtyard. The suffering of common folk, recorded in trembling hand, seemed less an occasion for compassion, and more a confirmation of the stern mandate he believed he had inherited from Providence. As the flames of rebellion lapped ever closer to the court's own thresholds, the Duke of Somerset, Edward's ambitious uncle, began to fear that his hold on power might slip away. Convinced that only by controlling the person of the king could he maintain his ascendancy, Somerset devised a desperate plan to remove Edward from the relative safety of Hampton Court and install him within the impregnable walls of Windsor Castle. Thus, on the night of October the 6th, 1549, a retinue of armed guards crept through the moonlit corridors of the palace, lifting the sleeping child from his bedclothes and conveying him, shivering and startled, to a waiting barge on the Thames. Windsor's round towers gleamed in the torchlight as Edward was brought into the castle's inner ward. Drums pounded a constant warning, watchmen paced the battlements, and rockets exploded overhead in ceremonial salute. Yet to the frightened boy, the fortress felt more like a prison. He complained bitterly of the chill that seeped through the stone floors, of the damp walls that echoed with the drip of nighttime moisture, and of the meagre bedding that offered little comfort against the cold. "There are no galleries in which to walk, nor gardens in which to rest," he wrote later, his pale hand tracing the words with a grief beyond his years. "I am a prisoner in my own kingdom, and no child should endure such indignity." By dawn, Somerset himself approached the young king, attempting to soothe his fears with gentle words. Yet Edward, cheeks flushed with indignation, rose from his pallet and declared in clear, unwavering tones that, "My person is mine own, and no man may lay hands upon it without my will." In that single statement, the child sovereign reclaimed his authority, withdrawing the slender thread of support he had lent to Somerset's regency. The Duke, confronted with the stark refusal of the boy he had hoped to control, realized that his power rested on nothing firmer than the sovereign's favour. Within days, Somerset was arrested, lodged in the Tower of London, and tried on 29 charges of malfeasance and ambition. The once mighty protector was found guilty, and, in the grim ritual of Tudor justice, his head was taken from his shoulders, a fate that Edward recorded in his journal with solemn brevity and apparent equanimity. Through this extraordinary turn of events, Edward VI, no more than a child, revealed himself as a monarch wholly aware of his prerogative. Though he had grown up under Regent's tutelage and had known the rod of Cox as much as the Council of Cranmer, he now demonstrated the keen instinct to wield royal power in his own defence. His decisive rejection of Somerset's manoeuvres marked a watershed in his political maturation, proving that even at 12 he would not tolerate the usurpation of his person or his prerogative. In the weeks that followed, the rebellions in the west were stamped out, and Windsor Castle's walls, once a site of fear and confinement, became a symbol of royal resolve. Edward returned to Hampton Court with his authority reaffirmed, the corridors echoing once more with the measured step of their restored king. And though the country's wounds would take many years to heal, that chill autumn night in October 1549 stands as testament to Edward's early aptitude for self-preservation and sovereign command. An aptitude born in the heart of a boy, yet tempered by the fierce necessity of survival. In the year 1549, the western shires of England erupted in a fierce backlash against the Crown's religious reforms. Villagers in Devon, Cornwall, Sussex, and Gloucestershire seized their newly printed English prayer books and hurled them into bonfires, their faces lit by the dancing flames. Bands of insurgents attacked marching soldiers and royal commissioners alike, wielding scythes and cudgels against the banners of the Privy Council. Markets emptied, manor gates slammed shut, and the countryside bristled with defiance as the people sought to reclaim the familiar Latin Mass that had long shaped their weekly devotions. King Edward VI, though only 12 years old, followed each development with keen interest as if studying a military exercise. In his private journal, scribbled in a small, precise hand, he recorded the suppression of each uprising with clinical detachment, the deployment of 200 cavalry to quell the rebels at Bodmin, the encirclement of 300 insurgents in Bridgewater, and the grim tally at Taunton, where 120 were slain and 40 taken. Each entry was more than mere notation. It reflected a boy's fascination with strategy, the placement of pikemen and musketeers, and the crushing of resistance with swift, brutal efficiency. To Edward's mind, these actions were necessary measures to preserve order and the Crown's sacred authority. Amid this turmoil, the Duke of Somerset, Edward's ambitious uncle and Lord Protector, grew increasingly anxious. He feared that the very rebellions he was charged with suppressing might turn the council's favour against him. In a desperate bid to secure his power, Somerset concocted a plan to isolate the young king, removing him from the relative ease of Hampton Court and taking him instead to the fortress of Windsor Castle. Thus, on the night of October the 6th, 1549, Somerset's guards crept into Edward's bedchamber, lifting the reluctant monarch from his bedclothes and bearing him, trembling and bewildered, through moonlit corridors to the waiting barge on the Thames. At Windsor, the scene was one of martial theatre. Drums rolled out warnings, watchmen patrolled the ramparts, and rockets burst overhead in fiery arcs, illuminating the castle's stone walls. Yet for Edward, the stronghold felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. He complained bitterly of the damp cold that seeped through the flagstones, the musty smell of the vaulted chapel, and the meagre bedding that did little to ward off the night air. "There are no galleries for my repose," he wrote later, "nor gardens in which to take the air. I am held here against my will, a prisoner of those who claim to guard me." His lamentations, recorded with a child's honesty, revealed his unwillingness to be treated as a mere pawn in courtly machinations. When Somerset approached him at dawn with placating words, Edward's frustration reached its peak. He confronted his uncle in the great hall, snatching the orb from Somerset's hand and declaring, "My person is mine own, and I will not suffer my liberty to be taken without cause." In that single act of defiance, the boy king reclaimed his authority, withdrawing the faint support he had lent to Somerset's protectorate. The realization that his power lay in the royal favour itself, and not merely in the regent's offices, struck Somerset like a blow. Within days, the Duke was arrested, carried in chains to the Tower of London, and indicted on 29 counts of treason, corruption, and ambition. His trial was swift. The evidence of his misdeeds, misappropriation of funds, unlawful seizures of estates, and summoning councils without royal assent proved overwhelming. Somerset's head fell beneath the executioner's axe, a grim testament to the young king's newfound resolve. Edward recorded the event in his journal without flourish, noting simply that the protector was judged and suffered accordingly, his tone betraying neither joy nor regret, but a sober acceptance that the Crown's defence sometimes required ruthless action. Through this dramatic episode, Edward VI emerged as a monarch far beyond his years, one who understood instinctively that the protection of his person was inseparable from the exercise of sovereign power. His decisive stand against Somerset demonstrated that even at 12 he would not tolerate the manipulation of his office or the subversion of his authority. It was a moment of political awakening, a lesson in the perils of regency, and the necessity of self-determination for any crowned head. In the weeks that followed, Windsor Castle's towers became a symbol of royal inviolability rather than fear, and Edward returned to Hampton Court with his stature greatly enhanced. Though the country's wounds from rebellion ran deep, and the scars of Somerset's tenure lingered in the whispers of court, the boy king's resolve shone like a beacon. Even the youngest sovereign could wield the crown's power with determination, safeguarding both his person and his prerogative against the intrigues of those who would claim his throne. In the quiet aftermath of the Somerset affair, the Regency Council underwent a significant transformation, casting aside the notion of a single protectorship and instead embracing a truly collective leadership. Henceforth, no one man would hold singular sway over the realm. Instead, Edward, now in his 13th year, began to step from the shadows of ceremony into the full light of genuine sovereignty. From the spring of 1550 onward, contemporary chronicles note that the young king no longer served merely as a rubber stamp on the council's decrees, but took up his place among them as an active participant in the making of policy. He lent his signature to proclamations authorizing new regulations, sat through the measured deliberations of cabinet meetings within the Painted Chamber, and lent his assent to the annual budget milestones that together marked the first time Edward VI truly governed England in his own right. While the council toiled over quotidian matters, briefing farmers on tithes, adjudicating disputes over manorial leases, and ensuring the efficient collection of customs duties, Edward devoted himself to crafting an image of himself as a divine right monarch, one whose authority was drawn not from Parliament alone, but from the very voice of God. He understood that to wield power effectively, he must pair political might with a resolute religious conviction, and he set about demonstrating both with singular purpose. And so, in quick succession, he issued orders deposing bishops deemed too sympathetic to lingering Catholic practices, dissolving the Feast of the Purification commonly known as Candlemas, and outlawing the ancient custom of processional pageants that had once wound through village streets, their floats bearing carved images of saints and relics. The boy king's zeal did not stop there. He commanded the destruction of frescoes that depicted the venerable images of Christ triumphant and the early Christian martyrs, ordering church wardens to chip away at painted walls with hammers and chisels until only bare plaster remained. In place of gilded altars, he established simple communion tables, each draped with plain white cloth, upon which lay an open Bible, the true altar of his envisioned Church of England. Through these emphatic acts of iconoclasm, Edward's personal authority shone bright, illuminating the principle that a monarch must sometimes wield the sword of reform as fiercely as he might wield the sceptre of state. Yet in the hushed corridors of Whitehall, where courtiers once whispered doubts about the wisdom of such sweeping changes, there arose a palpable sense of respect, and even a touch of trepidation for the young sovereign whom God had anointed to this sacred task. To see a king scarcely past boyhood ordering the dismantling of age-old religious rites, and to see him do so with neither hesitation nor apology, was to witness the embodiment of a doctrine once preached only by reformers and theologians, that the Crown's commission was not merely political but divine. As one ambassador noted in a heavily underlined dispatch, "The king speaks as though anointed by heaven itself, and we must heed both his word and his will." In this era of transformation, Edward VI stood as the living nexus of faith and governance, the ruler whom Providence had raised to purify the Church and to guide the realm along a path of renewed sanctity. His actions, though severe, inspired both awe and compliance. They reshaped the landscape of worship from cathedral to chapel and from rural parish to urban pulpit. Under his hand, England's religious identity solidified into a form of Protestant piety unlike any in Europe, more stringent than the gentler reforms of distant Lutheran princes, yet infused with that same conviction that true faith must be unencumbered by the trappings of tradition. And so, as the candles guttered low in the palace chapel and the echoes of hammers faded into the night, the boy king's vision persisted in the silent whitewashed walls, in the empty niches once home to carved saints, and in the open pages of Bibles now scattered throughout the land. His insistence on absolute religious uniformity, held fast by royal decree, left the court alternately admiring his courage and dreading his stern resolve. For though Edward remained young in years, he had proven himself both a devout servant of God's purpose and an unflinching arbiter of royal power. a sovereign whose brief reign would resonate down the corridors of history as the moment when England embraced a new, divinely sanctioned order under a king who spoke with the voice of both law and the Almighty. Mary Tudor, Edward VI's elder half-sister, stood apart in more ways than birth. She was the only surviving princess of King Henry VIII, outside his chosen son, and under their father's third act of succession she occupied the second place in line to the throne. Yet Mary had never bowed to the shifting tides of her father's religious reforms. Hidden away in her East Anglian estates, she continued to celebrate the Mass in Latin, kneeling before carved altars and hearing the ancient chants that her heart knew by rote. Early in the year 1550, a messenger arrived bearing credentials from the Emperor Charles V himself, who petitioned for Mary to receive letters patent exempting her from the edicts against the Latin service. Mary, swathed in her black gowns, received the ambassador beneath low oak beams in her private oratory. Hope flickered in her chest as she read the imperial seal. Yet when the petition reached Edward's council, the young king himself denied it with unyielding firmness. "No subject may claim exception," his proclamation read, "for the law is equal over all souls in England." Faced with this rebuff, Mary resolved upon a desperate plan: to reach the continent and place herself under the emperor's protection. Under cover of darkness, she slipped from her manor in Essex to a secluded village church, where a small band of loyalists gathered in candlelit pews. There, she pledged herself to the enterprise, an embarkation at dawn to meet awaiting ships on the Thames. But the court spies were many, and the royal fleet lay in wait. French mercenaries on the river's edge and loyal troopers along the coasts forestalled her flight, seizing the vessel before it could clear the bar and forcing Mary to turn back. Her dreams of refuge dashed against the stern policy of her brother's government. Home again, Mary faced Edward's wrath. The young king, resolved to uphold the statutes he had inherited, ordered that her personal chaplains be stripped of their vestments and dismissed from her service without ceremony. He then demanded her presence in London to answer for her disobedience before the Privy Council. Mary, her back straight despite her losses, journeyed to the capital under guard, each mile a testament to her unbroken will. When she stood before the council at Whitehall, Edward, though still a mere boy, addressed her with the gravity of a seasoned monarch. He accused her of fomenting foreign intrigue and nullifying the realm's sacred laws. Mary's reply was simple and resolute: "My soul belongs to God alone, and my faith cannot be compelled by human decree." Her words, carried on a clear soprano voice, filled the council chamber with a quiet intensity that left even hardened councillors momentarily breathless. Yet Edward, bound by his own convictions and the expectations of his reformist circle, refused to grant her mercy. Though he lacked the power to burn his sister at the stake or imprison her in the Tower, Edward exercised his authority in subtler ways. He confined Mary to her East Anglian estates under close supervision, forbidding any public mass or procession within her domains. Commissioners arrived with written warrants to demolish hidden altars, ransack secret chapels, and seize all vestments and prayer books written in Latin. The whispered hymns that once drifted through her manor's corridors were silenced. The carved images that had once offered solace were splintered and cast aside. Throughout this harsh campaign, Mary remained unbowed. She rose each morning before dawn to say her office in a humble chamber, prostrate before a simple desk rather than an ornate altar. Like the ancient martyrs, she found strength in petitioning the Almighty rather than yielding to earthly authority. Her attendants, few and loyal, brought her words of scripture in Latin, comforting her with the familiar cadences that had sustained her since childhood. In the hush that settled over her estates, the absence of religious symbols spoke louder than any proclamation. Villagers who once knelt before painted saints now knelt before the open pages of English prayer books, imported by royal decree. Some wept over the loss of their traditions, others accepted the new order with cautious hope, yet all felt the weight of Mary's silent resistance, an echo of defiance that lingered behind locked doors and shuttered windows. Thus, in the months that followed, Mary's determination to maintain her faith became both a personal testament and a political symbol. Edward's measures to erase every trace of her defiance served to underline the depth of his own commitment to the Protestant cause. And though the princess's Latin rites were crushed beneath the machinery of the state, her steadfast refusal to abandon them spread like a quiet flame among those who still treasured the old faith. In the soft light of evening, As the wind sighed through East Anglian reeds, Mary's prayers rose once again, whispers against a backdrop of reform and repression. And though her body remained confined within her lands, her spirit soared beyond every demolished altar and whitewashed wall, a living reminder that faith, once kindled, cannot easily be extinguished by royal decree. In the soft dawn of April 1552, under the patient hand of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the Church of England received its second Book of Common Prayer. This new service represented not merely a revision of words, but a decisive turning point in the realm's spiritual life. The text removed every lingering trace of its Catholic past. No longer would the priest cross himself at the elevation of the host, and the two small crosses that had marked the words of consecration were abolished entirely. Instead, the liturgy proclaimed that the Word of God itself was the very heart of worship, unadorned and direct, flowing from pulpit to pew in clear, reverent English. For Edward, though only 14, this moment carried the weight of destiny. He lent his name to the proclamation, dispatching copies of the new prayer book to every cathedral, chapel, and parish church from Northumberland's fells to Cornwall's windswept bays. Commissioners rode out with bound volumes under their arms, their horses' hooves echoing through village lanes as they delivered the king's command: whitewash the frescoes, dismantle the carved rood screens, and replace images of saints with open Bibles. In many places, terrified craftsmen laboured through cold nights to smash sacred statuary and hide holy icons beneath layers of plaster. At court, the zeal of reform found its reward. Men who had long preached the cause of Puritan simplicity were elevated to bishoprics and deaneries. Their loyalty to the young king and Cranmer's vision earned them seats in the House of Lords. Vast tracts of former abbey lands, once hallowed by centuries of monastic devotion, were claimed by the crown, and then redistributed to noble families whose Protestant sympathies were beyond question. A new assembly of Protestant bishops took shape, each sworn to guard the new order, and to advance Edward's aspiration for a godly realm. Yet for all the sweeping changes, it was Edward's own steadfast leadership that set this era apart. He understood that reform could falter without discipline, and so he pressed his council to enforce uniformity with an unwavering hand. In letters signed by his hand, he admonished reluctant vicars to teach only in the English tongue, lest the old Latin rites seduce souls back into superstition. He demanded swift penalties for any who dared to celebrate the Mass or to cling to relics buried in hidden alcoves. Through each missive, his voice, though youthful, rang with the gravity of divine commission. Behind the curtain of official decrees lay the careful shaping of a national faith more rigorous than any in Western Europe. Where Lutheran princes had tolerated vestiges of their medieval practice, Edward sought a purity that brooked no compromise. The festivals of Candlemas and Corpus Christi, once occasions of lavish pageantry and communal revelry, were struck from the calendar. Processional crosses, carried through village streets to the rhythms of trumpets and drums, were replaced by silent processions to the communion rail, where the congregation knelt to receive bread and wine and then dispersed in quiet contemplation. In these late spring days, the Church of England transformed around him like a garden reshaped by masterful pruning. The old hedgerows of ritual were cut back, the tangled branches of ceremony cleared away, leaving a single, central vine of scripture and prayer. Though the labour was exacting and sometimes painful, church wardens burned priceless manuscripts. Artisans saw the statues they had carved, shattered beyond repair. Edward regarded each act as a necessary sacrifice for a higher purpose. In his nightly prayers, he gave thanks that under his reign, the people could now approach God directly, unmediated by the Pope or by priests who claimed to wield Christ's office as a spectacle. And yet, for all the resolute firmness of policy, Edward retained a certain gentleness toward his people. Proclamations spoke of mercy for the ignorant and infirm, urging that pastors guide the newly English-speaking congregations with patience and kindness. He commissioned tracts in simple verse to explain the new rites, envisioned catechisms that would teach children the Apostles' Creed in plain words, and directed that any elderly priest who had served faithfully might retire with a pension rather than face disgrace. Through these gestures, he sought not only to enforce, but to educate, to build consent rather than rely solely on compulsion. By mid-year, the Second Book of Common Prayer had entrenched itself as the cornerstone of Edward's Reformed Church. Parishioners no longer listened in silence to distant Latin. They now spoke their prayers aloud, their voices mingling in a tapestry of shared devotion. The cathedral choirs, stripped of complex chants, sang metrical psalms in English, their harmonies a new anthem of unity. As the summer sun climbed high, the nation found itself bound by a faith both austere and accessible, disciplined by law yet warmed by the people's own speech. In the hushed quiet that followed each Sunday service, one could sense the promise of a united realm, an England more orderly in worship, more steadfast in belief, and more resolute in purpose than ever before. Under Edward's steady hand, the second prayer book had become more than a book of prayers. It stood as a living testament to a young king's vision of a Protestant state, where the word of God reigned supreme and the crown upheld a singular, godly order. In the heat-drenched summer of 1550, Edward VI set forth from London on his annual summer progress, seeking both refuge from the stifling air of the capital and an opportunity to broadcast the reforms he held dear. He departed the palace gates surrounded by a glittering host of nearly 4,000 horsemen and courtiers, banners fluttering and trumpets sounding, the cavalcade winding its way out along the dusty highways toward the gentle hills and verdant meadows of the countryside. Yet, even as the ride began in high spirits, Edward soon learned that the royal purse was stretched nearly to breaking. Maintaining so vast a retinue strained the exchequer beyond endurance, and within days the number of mounted guards and attendants was halved, many returning to the city with rueful smiles and a promise to rejoin him if or when the treasury might permit. As the progress unfolded, the young king visited a succession of former monastic sites, castles and palaces that had once been abbeys and priories under his grandfather's and father's dissolutions. In each great hall he paused before the empty cloisters and the stone arches, their grooves once resonant with the whispered prayers of monks and nuns. He observed how those estates, parcelled out and sold to noble gentry, now bore the names and coats of arms of powerful families, each hearth warmed by revenues that once sustained the church. The sight impressed upon him the tangible fruits of the Reformation. Land and wealth transferred from the altars to the estates of loyal subjects, reshaping England's social and economic landscape. Yet amid these demonstrations of Tudor policy, Edward turned a keen, disapproving eye upon the kingdom's finances. He summoned ledgers and account rolls to his tent by flickering torchlight, inspecting entries with a seriousness that belied his years. As he studied the columns of debt and deficit, he felt a pang of dismay. The royal income was all but exhausted, drained by corruption and mismanagement within the council's ranks. He noted how subsidies and stipends meant to support his household had been diverted. He saw that even members of the royal family, such as the Duke of Cleves, found their allowances curtailed. To the boy sovereign, this disclosure was a bitter humiliation. "I am poorer than my father," he confided in a private entry, "and the weight of my office feels heavier for it." Yet from this stark revelation sprang Edward's renewed resolve. He began to propose measures that would recast the kingdom's economic foundation. In letters penned at dusk, he outlined a plan for a centralized cloth market, an English rival to the grand fairs of Antwerp, where standards of weight and measure would be enforced, tolls reformed, and merchants accorded royal protection. He envisioned a regulated exchange that would draw foreign buyers to London's quays and bolster domestic industry, lifting both Crown and Commons from fiscal peril. In parallel, he sketched the outlines of a naval and defensive scheme for Portsmouth. New quays to shelter increasing fleets, expanded warehouses for victualling ships, and the renovation of Southsea Castle's fortifications to guard the Solent's narrow channel. His advisers, accustomed to detail-laden dispatches, found themselves taking hurried notes as their sovereign, in lively bursts of energy despite the languid summer sun, detailed arcane elements of harbour defences and market charters with equal precision. Still, amid these weighty concerns, Edward allowed himself the pleasures of his youth. He lifted his bow at dawn to send arrows singing toward wooden targets, then joined the hunts at midday, his keen laughter echoing through the greenwood. He shared a flask of spiced wine with Barnaby Fitzpatrick beneath ancient oaks, teasing out from his friend the latest news from court and countryside, before returning to the labours of state as the evening shadows lengthened. In those moments of respite, one glimpsed the balance he struck between governance and recreation, an ability to revel in the chase one moment and the next, to deliberate on the minutiae of tariffs and tolls. By the time the progress drew to its close, the boy king had not only surveyed his realm's castles and churches, but also laid the groundwork for a vision he termed a modern England. though his time would prove too brief to see these reforms fully realized. The schemes he devised, that summer market reforms, naval upgrades, and tighter fiscal controls, hinted at the shape of a state both centralized and competitive, prosperous and defensible. In the quiet nights under the canvas of his tent, the sovereign's pen moved with steady purpose, writing proclamations that, had he lived, might have transformed England into a mercantile and maritime power far earlier than even its continental neighbours. And so, as Edward and his reduced retinue wended their way back to London, they carried with them not only memories of fresh breezes and the thrill of the chase, but also the promise of reforms born in the summer of 1550. A promise that, for a fleeting moment, seemed to hold the key to unlocking England's destiny as a modern, Protestant realm, guided by a youthful king whose dreams outpaced his years. Throughout the summer progress of 1552, Edward VI found himself balancing the pleasures of the hunt with the weighty matters of state. He rode out of London at dawn, accompanied by nearly 4,000 cavalry and courtiers, their banners flapping in the soft morning breeze. Yet it did not take long for the young king to recognize that such an immense retinue strained the royal coffers beyond endurance. Within days, he reluctantly ordered the dismissal of most of his mounted guard back to the capital, deeming the saving of the exchequer a more pressing necessity than ceremonial spectacle. As the leaner company journeyed onward, Edward paused. At each former abbey-turned-palace, those Gothic arches and soaring windows once filled by monks now repurposed as noble drawing rooms. In these spaces, he saw the tangible legacy of his grandfather's and father's suppression of monastic houses, the very stones themselves a testament to the decisive end of Roman Catholic dominion in England. He wandered beneath vaulted ceilings, noting how the once sacred cloisters had become libraries or banquet halls, and he felt in his heart both the gravity of reform and the sweep of history that carried him forward. One of the most critical stops on this progress was the naval port of Portsmouth and the adjoining Southsea Castle. From atop the castle's ramparts, Edward surveyed the Solent's gentle waters and the distant outline of the Isle of Wight. He praised Southsea as a modern fortification, yet, with a keenness born of recent studies in military engineering, he proposed a handful of improvements: reinforced parapets to withstand cannon fire, redesigned gun emplacements to allow wider arcs of coverage, and improved drainage to stave off winter's damp. When he turned his gaze to the twin forts of Camber, he frowned at their misaligned bastions and crumbling curtain walls, insisting they be reconstructed without delay to secure England's seaward approaches. Upon his return to London, Edward set pen to paper and compiled a detailed to-do list for his council. First and foremost, fortify Portsmouth. Nothing must threaten the kingdom's maritime gateway. Next, establish a centralized cloth market in London, modelled to rival the great fairs of Antwerp, complete with standardized weights, fair tolls, and a chartered company of clothiers under royal aegis. Finally, he sketched a reform of the Privy Council itself, calling for fewer secretaries, regular audits of crown revenues, and clearer lines of authority to curb corruption and increase efficiency. These initiatives revealed a statecraft nearly unprecedented in Europe, blending the duties of sovereign with the acumen of a merchant prince. Yet, for all his administrative fervour, Edward remained devoted to his youthful pastimes. In the quiet of the evening, he penned letters to Barnaby Fitzpatrick with genuine delight. He recorded each triumph at the archery butts, the precise count of bullseyes struck, the dry crack of arrow against target, and he even sketched little watercolour scenes of deer bounding through misty copses, each stroke of his brush capturing the thrill of the chase. His correspondence brimmed with that little Englander pride. He spoke not of conquest abroad, but of safeguarding his homeland's green fields and tranquil harbours. "Let others wage war on distant shores," he wrote, "but our duty is to defend this England that we love." In these letters, one saw the emergence of a monarch who could seamlessly transition from drafting market regulations at midday to loosing his bow in the golden haze of dusk. His reformist zeal, disciplined by a clear vision of national interest, coexisted with an unguarded joy in simple pleasures. He understood that true leadership required both rigorous governance and moments of repose, an equilibrium he had mastered unlike any other European prince of his time. Thus, as the summer wore on and the courts reconvened in London, Edward VI stood transformed from the shy child who had ascended the throne at 9 into a young king of insight and imagination. He had ridden far beyond the city walls, witnessed the vestiges of monastic glory, reinforced the bulwarks of national defence, and outlined economic schemes to lift the realm from penury. Yet he had also laughed with friends, composed verses by candlelight, and savoured the quiet thrill of arrow and horn. In that balance of duty and delight, of statecraft and sport, Edward's vision of a modern England found its purest expression. And were he granted the years to see these projects to fruition, he would have guided his kingdom into an era of prosperity and peace, built upon the twin pillars of prudence and pleasure, an England as steadfast in its reforms as it was joyous in its life. But for now, the boy king returned to Whitehall, his heart light with the glow of summer's achievements, and his mind brimming with plans to shape tomorrow's England according to the dreams he dared to dream. That summer's journey had filled Edward's heart with exhilaration. Yet upon his return to London's soot-laden streets, a quiet shadow crept across his youthful vigour. By February of 1553, a persistent, dry cough had taken hold of him, and he found himself growing weary with each passing sunrise. His cheeks, once ruddy with the flush of the chase, grew pale, and by March his frame had grown noticeably thinner, his garments hanging more loosely about his slender shoulders. Then, in April, the cough brought a grim confirmation. Edward began to cough up dark, blood-tinged sputum, a telltale sign of consumption, that most dreaded scourge of the age. In an era before effective remedies, the royal physicians could offer only restorative tonics, gentle admonitions to ease his burdens, and a reduction of courtly pressures in the hope that less stress might spare his failing breath. As his strength ebbed, Edward was carried first to Greenwich Palace, where the Thames breeze was thought to soothe laboured lungs, and later to lodgings near Street, James's, where the hush of quiet corridors might cradle him through the long nights. Yet even in the grip of mortal illness, the young king's devotion to his duty remained unbroken. Couriers still brought dispatches to his bedside, and he would pore over them by candlelight, his trembling finger tracing the lines of petitions and memoranda. He continued to approve economic schemes, tweaks to customs duties, proposals for market reforms, and plans to shore up the navy, each signature a testament to his resolve that England's wheel must not halt even as its sovereign faltered. Amid these labours of state, Edward found the strength to compose a final private testament of faith. With a hand weakened by fever, he drafted a prayer in clear English, no Latin invocations here, but a humble plea for mercy and guidance. It began, "O Lord God, who alone art worthy to receive the praise of all thy creatures, grant me steadfast faith and a serene spirit as I pass from this life into thy presence." In phrases both simple and profound, he laid bare the convictions that had carried him through every reform and every challenge, that salvation was found not in rituals of old, but in the living word of God, and that the king's true duty was to shepherd his people toward that light. Between moments of pain and weakness, Edward's thoughts turned to the fragile future of his realm. He wondered, with a growing sense of urgency, whether the sweeping reforms he had championed, iconoclasm, the English liturgy, the centralized offices of state, would endure without his guiding hand. Would the Book of Common Prayer still ring through parish churches, or would the old rites creep back in behind closed doors? Would the market reforms and naval improvements bear fruit, or would they falter in the face of neglect and corruption? Before his strength gave out entirely, Edward convened the Regency Council once more, summoning its members to Greenwich in the dim light of his private chamber. They came, men in sombre cloaks, their faces etched with concern. The king spoke in a quiet, measured voice. He asked for their solemn vows to defend the new religion against all who would restore the Pope's authority, and to safeguard the realm's finances against the mismanagement that had so nearly undone his efforts. The councillors, many of whom had served him since his earliest days, pledged their fealty, and pledged in turn to uphold the statutes and statutes alone. Yet even as they swore, the truth weighed heavily upon Edward's mind. The exchequer was all but bankrupt, drained by royal extravagance and the graft of unworthy officials. He knew that without a robust treasury, no long-term reform could stand. The armies would go unpaid, the markets would falter, and the people's faith might waver in the face of empty coffers. His heart ached as he realized that the very foundation of his principled governance, sound finance and disciplined administration rested upon a treasury thin as hope. As his breath grew more laboured and the shadows deeper, Edward's final audience with the council was both a farewell and a charge. He bade them to remember the lessons he had taught, that the crown's power came from God, that religion and governance were bound in righteous fellowship, and that the welfare of England depended upon the courage to enact and the wisdom to preserve bold reforms. With these last words lingering in the still air, the young king's hand fell away, and his courtiers knew that the hour of his passing could not be far distant. Thus Edward VI, consumed by consumption, faced mortality with the same resolve that had marked his brief reign. Even as his strength waned, he strove to secure the future of his kingdom in prayer and in policy. His final days, a testament to his enduring faith in a reformed England and to a sovereign's burden borne with steadfast heart until his last breath. Recognizing that his days were numbered, Edward VI resolved to secure the future of his realm with one final solemn act. Late in the spring of 1553, when his strength had ebbed to a whisper, he commissioned the drafting of his Device for the Succession, a personal testament that would alter the order of heirs prescribed by his father's statutes and acts of Parliament. Under those laws, his elder half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth stood first and second in line, yet Edward feared Mary's unwavering loyalty to Rome and doubted Elizabeth's willingness to countenance the removal of her sister. Thus, he set his mind on naming a successor who would preserve the Protestant settlement he had wrought, ensuring that the crown would pass into trustworthy hands. At first, the boy king considered naming the male descendants of his youngest sister, Mary Tudor, specifically her son, as his heir. But as he examined the family tree and found Mary's line lacking in surviving sons, he realized that this plan offered no immediate solution. Time pressed upon him like a gathering storm, and he knew there was no luxury for prolonged deliberation. In a swift and decisive stroke, Edward struck through those initial provisions and inscribed the name Lady Jane Grey, his cousin and granddaughter of Mary Tudor, as his chosen successor, accompanied by the phrase, "and the heirs male of her body." This careful language bound the crown to Jane and to her future sons, a formula designed to exclude both Mary and Elizabeth from the throne, while maintaining a veneer of dynastic continuity. Yet a device alone carried no authority without the sanction of those who governed in his name. Summoning the Regency Council to his bedside, Edward, though frail, exercised the full weight of his royal prerogative. He reminded each councillor in measured tones that his authority emanated not from human caprice, but directly from God, and that they were bound by both oath and conscience to uphold his final will. Many of the nobles bristled at the thought of contravening the letter of Henry VIII's Third Succession Act, yet none dared to oppose the boy king whose eye, though clouded by illness, still burned with resolute purpose. One by one, they signed the document, their quills scratching across parchment as they pledged fealty to Jane and to the Protestant course Edward had charted. In that moment, the device for the succession became law by royal command, a testament to Edward's decisive character and to the absolute nature of his authority. His hand, weakened though it was, had guided the crown's destiny beyond the bounds of established statute. He had wielded the sovereign's power to ensure that the reforms he had championed would not be undone by a Catholic monarch or by a sister who might hesitate to depose her sibling. In his final days, Edward embodied the principle that a king's charge was both temporal and divine, that he was God's instrument on earth, entrusted with the sacred mission of purifying church and state. Yet this bold act set in motion a succession crisis that would rock the Tudor dynasty to its core. In the hush that followed Edward's passing, the proclamation of Jane as queen met with both cautious support and covert resistance. Many courtiers and Londoners, nostalgic for a true Tudor monarch of the male line, rejoiced at the prospect of a new dynasty under Jane's gentle hand. Others, wary of the device's deviation from parliamentary statute, whispered of legal infirmities and of Mary's enduring claim. Within weeks, the realm would be torn between two queens, one designated by a dying king's pen, the other by centuries of dynastic law plunging England into the tumult of rival proclamations, armed musters, and political intrigue that gripped the nation for long, uncertain months. Thus, Edward VI's final ordinance, a document drafted in fevered urgency, stands as a poignant testament to his resolve. It revealed a king unafraid to override precedent to protect the Reformation, wielding his absolute authority with a clarity and firmness that belied his tender years. And yet, in securing his own vision of a Protestant succession, He unwittingly sowed the seeds of a crisis that would follow in his wake, shaking the very foundations of Tudor rule almost as swiftly as his life had ended. On the 6th day of July in the year 1553, young Edward VI drew his final, laboured breath within the quiet chambers of Whitehall Palace. He had reached the tender age of 15, yet he bore upon his pale shoulders the weight of a kingdom's hopes and fears. In his last hours he whispered a single wish, that no swift messenger carry word of his passing to his half-sisters, Mary or Elizabeth. He feared that news of his death might ignite their ambitions and undo the fabric of reform he had so painstakingly woven. Thus, his secret was kept close, shared only among those who served the true cause of the Reformation. For 3 long days, courtiers and reformers moved in hushed conference, shoring up their alliances and preparing the proclamation that would place Lady Jane Grey upon the throne. The council feared that haste would prove fatal to their hard-won gains, so they delayed the anxious populace while their supporters, both noble and merchant, waited with bated breath. When at last the time came, Edward's funeral was held within the venerable walls of Westminster Abbey, but it bore the mark of his Protestant convictions rather than the rituals of old. No incense drifted through the vaulted nave, nor did the mournful tolling of Catholic bells interrupt the service. Instead, the mourners bowed their heads as ministers read prayers from the Book of Common Prayer in clear, plain English. The king's body lay in a simple wooden coffin, stripped of gilding or silver, emblematic of the sober humility he had long advocated. Hundreds of dignitaries attended, stalwart bishops in sombre robes, ministers whose labours Edward had once guided, and soldiers who had marched at his command to quell rebellions. Yet conspicuous by their absence were those whom the succession had cast out. Mary and Elizabeth, and even Lady Jane Grey, still awaiting her own elevation, remained distant. The Catholic faction, cautious and watchful, had sealed off their estates and kept their presence from the abbey, unwilling to lend legitimacy to a ceremony so at odds with their faith. Thus the boy king's funeral passed in solemn tranquillity, the echoes of earth to earth, ashes to ashes, lingering in the pale morning light. Though his reign had been brief, the memory of Edward VI resonated deeply among his subjects. Many wept openly for the young sovereign, a monarch of rare devotion who had carried the cross of reform upon his slender back. Commoners spoke of his kindness in allowing English prayers in their parish churches. Merchants recalled his efforts to revive the cloth trade and fortify the ports, and scholars praised his learning, which had kindled an intellectual flowering at court. Yet even in Grief, darker murmur stirt. The treasury lay nearly bare, its coffers emptied by war, building projects, and corruption. The Catholic old guard plotted in secret chambers, determined to reclaim lost ground, and Mary Tudor, still alive and defiant, waited in East Anglia, her heart set on restoring the Latin Mass. England stood at a vital crossroads, its future hinging upon the fragile strength of those who would follow Edward's path. In the days that followed, a final portrait was unveiled, a sombre likeness of the departed king. His cheeks were drawn, and his eyes shadowed, yet within that pallor glimmered an unwavering flame. The artist had captured the solemn determination etched upon his features, the steely resolve that had guided him through rebellion, reform, and political peril. Even in death, Edward VI's visage conveyed the paradox of his brief life. The vulnerability of youth combined with the authority of a monarch consecrated by God's own hand. And so, as the abbey's doors closed upon his coffin and the pallbearers dispersed into the morning mist, England gazed upon the legacy of its boy king with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. His reforms stood incomplete, his exchequer drained, and his realm divided. Yet his spirit endured in every whitewashed chapel, in every English prayer uttered at dawn, and in the hearts of those who believed that true faith and good governance must walk hand in hand. In the silent hush that followed Edward's passing, one could almost hear his whispered vow echoing through the ages, that England, though shaken, would rise in the light of a reformed faith. And as candles guttered and courtiers drifted home, the memory of the young sovereign lingered, an ember of reform, a testament to the power of conviction, and a reminder that even the shortest life can leave an indelible mark upon a nation's soul. Barely had Edward VI's final breath faded before the Regency Council moved swiftly to proclaim Lady Jane Grey as England's new monarch, thus inaugurating the brief and tumultuous chapter known ever since as the 9 Days Queen. For many in the corridors of power and among London's merchants, Jane represented the continuity of Tudor blood, an English sovereign whose roots lay unquestioned in these isles. Yet beneath the veneer of conservative hope, a far more potent current was gathering strength. The Catholic faction, rallied by the covert support of Princess Mary, began to wield influence in hidden salons and taverns alike. By the second day of Jane's reign, banners bearing Mary Tudor's emblem fluttered on London's walls, and thousands of citizens, tailors, smiths, and clerks marched through Cheapside, proclaiming their loyalty to the rightful heir under Mary's standard. Their chant, echoing off timber-framed houses, carried a simple message: "We will have Mary for our queen." Faced with this surging tide of popular sentiment, the council's nerves frayed. Envoys sent to quell the uprising found themselves turned back by crowds determined to reverse the late king's plans. On the 9th day, Jane Grey acceded to the inevitable. In a solemn declaration before the Privy Council, she renounced her claim, lifting Henry VIII's sceptre from her trembling grasp and setting it aside in deference to Mary's superior title. That same afternoon, Mary I rode into the city in triumph, her accession marking a swift and complete reversal of Edwardian reforms. Within weeks, Protestant clergy were stripped of their livings, and many now branded as heretics fled to the continent with hastily packed trunks. The Latin Mass returned to parish churches, its ancient chants rising once more beneath vaulted arches, and the battered rood screens and shattered stained glass were replaced wherever possible, as though to erase every trace of the boy king's iconoclasm. Yet even in the face of Mary's zealous restoration of Catholic rites, Edward VI's legacy endured in several foundational measures. First and foremost stood the Second Book of Common Prayer, published in 1552, which had codified English worship and provided the legal framework for the Church of England's doctrines and ceremonies. Though Mary banned its use, the text remained in hidden chapels and private collections, ready to be resurrected by future reformers. Likewise, Edward's statutes strengthening the Crown's supremacy over the Church, his acts of uniformity and royal injunctions, would later be invoked by Elizabeth I to cement her own religious settlement. Beyond religion, Edward's reign had established a more centralised form of governance that tightened the Privy Council's oversight of local magistrates and created specialised commissions for finance, navy, and trade. Though Mary reversed many personnel appointments, she could not fully dismantle the machinery he had built. His economic proposals, centralised cloth markets, regulated weights and measures, and fortifications at Portsmouth, offered a blueprint for England's emergence as a mercantile and maritime power in the decades to come. Most poignantly, Edward's own writings, his personal chronicle, his French treatise against papal supremacy, and the English prayer he drafted on his deathbed survive as direct windows into the mind of a monarch whose youthful zeal had burned brighter than his years. Historians treasure these manuscripts not only as records of policy, but as reflections of a sincere desire to bind church and state in godly union. And yet, the rapid unravelling of his reforms under Mary's rule imparted a hard lesson: that no matter how well-intentioned or boldly conceived, religious and administrative change demands broad support among nobles and commoners alike. Absent such consensus, even the most sweeping reforms can be overturned as swiftly as they were enacted. Edward VI's vision of a purely Protestant England, noble though it was, lacked the deep roots needed to withstand the counter-Reformation fury of his sister's reign. Thus, when Edward departed this world at 15, he left historians with an enduring question: could England ever become the thoroughly Protestant realm he imagined? The answer, debated through the centuries, remains as elusive as the flickering candlelight in which he once penned his prayers. For though his flame burned fiercely, it burned too brightly and too briefly, leaving behind both the glow of promise and the shadow of what might have been. And so, as the echoes of courtly intrigue and the fervour of reform gently recede into memory, we find ourselves in a quiet twilight, where the soft candlelight of Edward's brief reign flickers into stillness. Let your mind drift through the vaulted halls of Hampton Court and the solemn arches of Westminster Abbey, imagining each carved stone growing distant as your thoughts float free. Picture the young king's determined gaze soften, his fervent hand laying down the Book of Common Prayer for the last time, and feel the hush of centuries settle around you like a warm, comforting cloak. In that gentle calm, we remember the true message of his story, that even the most passionate visions must be nourished by compassion and shared by the hearts of many. For lasting change depends as much on unity as it does on courage. We carry forward the lesson that conviction, tempered by understanding and tempered by kindness, can guide a nation toward greater hope, and that every one of us holds the spark of transformation within our own hands. Now, let the final images fade. The banners of reform drifting away on a summer breeze, the silhouette of a lone scholar closing his manuscript under the glow of a single lantern, and the distant silhouette of Windsor Castle, standing silent beneath a darkening sky. Allow the details to dissolve as the world softens around you, until all that remains is the gentle whisper of history's promise. May you rest in the warmth of these reflections, cradled by the knowledge that even brief lives can leave enduring light. Sleep well, dear listener, and when you awaken, may you carry with you a calm heart and a curious spirit. If you've journeyed with us tonight, please subscribe to our channel so that in the days to come, you'll discover more tales that stir the imagination and soothe the soul. Good night, and sweet dreams.